Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar series organized by CMCC Foundation. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Roberto Schaeffer, who is a professor of energy economics at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Before moving to today's talk, let me say a few words about the organization, CMCC, which was founded in 2005. It's a research center focusing on climate change and the interaction with the environment, society, business, and policymakers. CMCC is an organization that consists of a network of research centers and universities distributed across Italy in different places in the Italian territory. The range of topics that are being investigated by CMCC varies a lot, from economics, policy, to agriculture, ecosystem, and ocean. We have 8 divisions that cover different aspects of climate change. They share different skills and methods to approach climate change. If you want, the common denominator is modeling. And we use modeling to make economic scenarios as well as climate projection of the future. Outreach is also very important at CMCC, and together with Forestry University, CMCC has one of the few PhD programs in science and maintenance climate change. And from this year, they have also launched a master program, Master of Research on this topic. So before giving the floor to Roberto, let me first remind you the rules of the game. The webinar will be recorded and it will be available online on CMCC website afterwards. At the end, there will be a Q&A session. Please use the chat room provided by the GoToWebinar interface to raise your questions. And when asking a question, please mention your name, country, and affiliation. Today we have many people online, about 50 people connected. Looking forward to your talk. So now I would like to give the floor to you. You have about 30 minutes and then we will have some time for the questions. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Okay, thank you very much, Enrica. Thank you very much for the CMCC for the invitation. As Enrica said, my name is Roberto Schaeffer. I'm a professor at the Energy Planning Program of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And I have been working with energy issues for the past 25 years. And I have been involved in the IPCC for the past 20 years. And that's why more and more the work that I do in Brazil is climate related, but with a very strong basis on energy issues. And what I'm going to be presenting here today is an ongoing work that we have in Brazil. And although you may not be interested in Brazil, somehow some lessons, some of the discussion that we're going to be having here, I think may be very interesting for any country, because basically what I'm going to try to show here is the implications of some short-term decisions for long-term, or for the long-term implications of climate change. And basically here, what I'm going to try to show is that in the case of Brazil, but I think we can generalize that, instead of thinking about a NDC and then later on think about mid-term strategies, we should work the other way around. We need to know where we want to go and then work backwards to say, okay, if I want to go there, where I'm going to be or where I need to be by 2030 to get there by 2050. And that's what I'm going to show here, that in the case of Brazil, it does make all the difference. Let's say, if you know where you want to go, where you should be in 2030, and I'm going to be discussing here 2 scenarios, in fact 3. Let's say a kind of business as usual scenario, then a 2-degree scenario, and then a 1.5-degree scenario. And what's interesting in the case of Brazil, but somehow, as I said, we could generalize that a 1.5 degree is not exactly a 2 degree with more emphasis on this or that. It's a completely different scenario. It's a completely different portfolio of options if you want to go to a 1.5 degree world. And I'm going to be showing this later on. Very briefly, just to give a broad view of the kind of work that we do, and basically the kind of models that we use or that we have developed, and that I'm going to be using here. And just come from, I'm going to show you, let's say, from the bottom to the top. So the first, let's say, box that we see here is the blues model. What's the blues model? In fact, the blues model is a model that we began to develop in the early 2000s, and at that time it was an energy-only model for Brazil. At that time, that energy model had about 300 technologies, like different kinds of power plants, different types of energy consumption in industry, in the residential sector, etc., etc. And over time, that 300 technologies model evolved to a 8,000 technologies model. So now we have an energy model for Brazil with 8,000 technologies split in 6 different regions of the country. Why 8,000 technologies? Because not only we have different possibilities for nuclear power plants, different possibilities for coal power plants with CCS, without CCS, pulverized coal, this kind of coal, natural gas, combined cycle, open cycle, but also the demand side is extremely well detailed. So, for example, for a scenario for energy demand in Brazil by 2050, my model may decide to build a new nuclear power plant or to replace incandescent light bulbs by LED light bulbs because they are more efficient. In that case, you may not need to have a nuclear power plant. So now we have this 8,000 technologies model for the energy sector. Now we are beginning to incorporate water consumption into that model, so also water becomes a constraint. So eventually the model may not choose to be the hydro or a nuclear in a particular place, because the model may see that there is no water available for that, and then the model may choose a different option. Also, we are incorporating air pollution into the model. So also we can put a constraint on air pollution for the different technologies the model will choose. Okay, but this is a least cost optimization model for Brazil. But we are not happy with that, and I'm going to be showing why. Because in the case of Brazil, when we use such kind of models for climate change mitigation, you have to have in mind that roughly 50%, if not more than emissions in Brazil, do not come from the energy sector. They come from agriculture, they come from deforestation, they come from other sectors of the economy which are not energy related, and they are not only CO2, but they may be also methane, they may be N2O. So there are other gases that eventually for Italy, for Europe, are not that relevant. But for some developing countries like Brazil, Indonesia, etc., these non-CO2 gases or these non-energy activities may even be more important than energy activities. And that's why some 2 or 3 years ago, we built this blues model, which is our original energy model, but now with land use into it. So now we have in this blues model,
deforestation, agriculture, livestock, etc. Now the model can choose between planting more forests or having energy efficiency or having nuclear power plants. So basically the model sees all possible technologies, all possible sectors of the economy, and try to minimize, let's say, emissions by choosing the least cost option for that. But then we're not happy with that as well, because when you talk about climate change, what does it mean to talk about Brazil? What does it mean to talk about 2-degree world or 1.5? We need to talk about the world to see what's the place of Brazil in this world. And that's why we developed this next model, which is the COPPE model. What's the COPPE model? It's a global integrated assessment model for the world, splitting the world in 18 different regions, and also each one of these regions, for example, Japan is one region, US is one region, Canada is one region, India is one region, China, those countries that we have data and that we think are relevant to be one region. The EU is one region, Brazil is one region. So now we have this COPPE model, it's a global model, where we also have agriculture, livestock, forest, and energy into it. Okay, now we can run our global model for a 2-degree world or 1.5-degree world, and then see what's the role of Brazil in that model. So we took the boundary conditions from this global model and imposed on Brazil. Because how can I have a national model? Because in order to run a national model for Brazil, I need to have, for example, oil prices. I need to have international trade. And I can only have oil price international trade if I have a global model that can provide this kind of information for me, because otherwise I can always export and import, assuming that what I export, the world will be interested in buying, and what I import, I'm going to be available to import from somewhere else. But if I don't, a global model show me that, okay, eventually there are some limitations for import and export international price. So now we have this global model. But both the blues model and the COPPE model, they are bottom-up model. They are very detailed in the technology level. As I said, the blues model in the energy sector alone has 8,000 technologies. The COPPE model for each one of the 18 regions have probably more than 500 energy technologies for each one of these regions. But then, okay, I need something else. I need to have let's say, a macroeconomic scenario for the world to be able to provide this information through a bottom-up model like this COPPE model. And that's why now we are finishing the T model, which is a CGE model, a global CGE model that splits the world in 18 regions, which matches perfectly our COPPE model, which is the global model, and which matches perfectly our national model. Okay, with this suite of models, now I can run 2C scenarios for the world, 1.5, and see the role of Brazil in this world. And this is exactly what I'm going to be showing to you today. Okay, I'm not going to spend too much time, but the COPPE model, as I said, 18 regions, just to show you what are the regions that we have in this model, and what we have done with this global model. Basically, we have run 3 different scenarios. The first scenario, which I call this NPI scenario or GCP scenario, is a global current policy scenario. Okay, assuming that the current policies in place today will continue forever, and then, okay, where the world will go in terms of emissions, in terms of different economic sectors, energy consumption, etc., etc. Then a 2-degree scenario for this world and a 1.5-degree scenario. How did we do that? This work that I'm going to present here is part of a larger project, which is called the CDLinks project, where we have various, let's say, groups involved. Let's say CMCC is involved in this effort as well. And basically, we are running similar scenarios for the different partners of this project, and then we compare results. And in this scenario that we're running, based on some simple climate models, we came up with a world, or a 2C world, which will be a world that between 2011 and 2100, some 1,000 gigatons of CO2 could be emitted to keep the world inside 2 degrees. A 1.5-degree scenario in our community using a simple climate model, the MAGIC C climate model, we see that if we emit only 400 gigatons of CO2 between 2011 and 2100, with a certain probability, we can say that we will stay within a 1.5-degree world. Okay, so what I did is exactly that. I imposed in my COPPE model this constraint that by 2100, the globe will not be able to emit more than 1,000 gigatons of CO2, or in a 1.5-degree scenario, that the world will not be able to emit more than 400 tons of gigatons of CO2 by 2100. And these are the constraints that I put in my global model. Of course, I'm not going to go into details, but basically what we see here, okay, in the business as usual scenario, as expected, emissions in the globe will continue to go up. Energy is going to be the most important part of those emissions, but let's say emissions from AFOLU also will continue to exist, but because of deforestation, killing all the forests of the world, these emissions will go down over time. And also, when we look into primary energy, we see that in this current business as usual scenario, the globe by 2100 would rely mostly, or continue to rely mostly, on fossil fuel energy. And also we see in our global model, okay, that in terms of land use change, what I have indicated here is that deforestation will continue to happen. That's why we have, let's say, less landed area. But what's below the X axis is a decrease in the available area. So we see, let's say, the crop area will increase over time. Let's say the grass area will increase over time to have more cattle, to have more agriculture. And basically this land will come from, let's say, from forests, etc., etc. So this is basically a current business scenario world. If you move into a 2C scenario, what my coffee model says is say, okay, to keep the world within 2 degrees, basically by 2050 approximately, we have to begin to have negative emissions from the energy sector, but you're still gonna have positive emissions from land use. But on average, the world will need to go negative in terms of CO2 emissions by 2070 approximately, which is very much in line with the Paris Agreement that explicitly states that after the middle of the century, in order to keep the temperature below 2C, we have to go negative. So basically, it seems that our model is calibrated, it's good enough to show what the Paris Agreement was indicating. And in this 2C degree world, basically see that renewables have to play a much more important role. And also we begin to see a different behavior in land use, and we begin to see a net reforestation by 2100 as a consequence to have some negative emissions to keep the world inside 2 degrees. Okay, not going to spend too much time on this. In the case of 1.5 degrees, the same picture, but basically we anticipate by 10 or 15 years the same kind of behavior that would be expected. So negative emissions by 2060, more renewables, and reforestation showing up much earlier than that. Okay, so what do I need this? Basically, I need this to show, okay, here for the globe, we see that a 2 degree world does not look much different than a 1.5 degree world in aggregate terms. Basically, we are anticipated negative emissions by 10 or 15 years. But my interest is to see at a national level, what would be the implications of a 2C world and a 1.5. So what did I do? Because I have this global model with 18 regions, basically I saw what would be the carbon budget for Brazil in this global model when I run this global model for a 2 degree world and a 1.5. So the result that I get from my global model, since Brazil is one region, is that the total amount of CO2 emissions Brazil will be allowed to emit between 2011 and 2050 is about 24 gigatons of CO2. This would be the carbon budget of Brazil in the optimal world that's looking for the least cost solution to meet the 2 degree target, or Brazil would have a carbon budget of 17 gigatons of CO2 up to 2050 for this optimum least cost world that wants to meet the target of 1.5 C degree. So based now what I did, I took these 2 carbon budgets and put this carbon budget as constraints to my national model. So now my national model knows what it has to do in order to have a scenario that's compatible with a 2C or 1.5 degree world. Why I'm showing this, just there are some studies using global models available in the literature. We've come up with different carbon allocations for Brazil in a 2 degree scenario. And funny enough, if we take the average of all studies that we found in the literature, the average budget for Brazil would be roughly the same number that our global model shows as the budget for Brazil in a 2C world. Again, showing that it seems that our model is very much behaving is a well-behaved model. Okay, very briefly, so I take these 2 carbon budgets now and impose those carbon budgets to my national model, to the blues model. So this is exactly what I'm saying here. I say I'm gonna run a current policy scenario for Brazil, a 2 degree scenario for Brazil, and 1.5, understanding that a 2C scenario for Brazil is a scenario that I only allow my model to emit 24 gigatons of CO2 up to 2050, and a 1.5 degree scenario for Brazil, I only allow my model to emit 17 gigatons of CO2 up to 2050. Okay, of course, I'm not going to go into details here, but we see that in a let's say current policy scenario, this would be the behavior of emissions in Brazil. So we see here in the bottom CO2 emissions from energy, then we see CO2 emissions from deforestation, basically, then we see CO2 emissions from industrial processes, methane emissions from, it's wrong here, it's methane emissions from AFOLU, no, sorry, it's from energy, then methane emissions from AFOLU, and then N2O emissions also from AFOLU. So you see that energy is not that important in Brazil in terms of emissions, and that's why it's important to have an integrated model that also accounts for other greenhouse gases and also accounts for other sectors of the economy. And then, okay, I'm not going to go deep into here. This is going to be how the energy sector would behave in Brazil over time. And here we see that it's very particular of Brazil. Oil consumption is high, gas consumption, coal not much, but then we have biomass and sugarcane biomass are extremely important in Brazil. Why they are so important? When you talk about biomass here, not only we are talking about, for example, all diesel sold in Brazil is a blend of 8% biodiesel and 92% diesel. So we need biomass for that. A substantial share of the iron and steel industry in Brazil uses charcoal as opposed to coal to produce the process. So also, we still have some firewood use in rural areas in Brazil. So that's why biomass is important. And also sugarcane biomass is isolated here because the ethanol sector is extremely important in Brazil. All cars sold in Brazil in the past 15 years, they are what we call flexi-fuel cars. They can run on any combination of gasoline and ethanol. You go to the gas station, you look at the price at the pump, and then you decide if you put gas in your car or if you put ethanol, depending upon the price of the fuel. So ethanol is extremely important, and also sugarcane bagasse for power generation. So it's a very peculiar, let's say, energy mix. Okay, when I impose to my model that carbon budget for a 2C world, then I see how my national model behaves. And then, for example, I see that in that case, the model begins to see negative emissions from land use by 2035 already and more over time. So we see that we have negative emissions coming from the forest sector in order to compensate for positive emissions from other sectors, so that this dashed line is the net result of CO2 equivalent emissions in Brazil. Okay, when I look into, let's say, the energy sector, I'm not going to go into details here because I want to spend more time later on something else. We see that renewables have to play a much important role in a 2C world in the case of Brazil. If you go to a 1.5 degree scenario for Brazil, then I see that by 2050, Brazil is in a direction of a net zero greenhouse gas emissions profile. Why? Because we still have positive emissions from some parts of the economy, but then we have lots of negative emissions from other parts of the economy to compensate for those non-CO2 gases that cannot be reduced to zero. Okay, and as expected, a 1.5 degree Brazil, see a lot of, now we see the difference here in terms of what's going to be the share of biomass in Brazil and sugarcane, but mostly biomass, to be able to comply with this 1.5 degree world. Why we have so much biomass? I'm going to explore this in the final slides here. Is because my model sees a great opportunity for BECCS, for bio-CCS. And in order to have bio-CCS, or in order to have negative emission from the energy sector, I have to have biomass to be able to have negative emissions. And so basically the opportunity cost of biomass in Brazil goes to zero because what the model is looking for is negative emission, not for bioenergy. And then basically the model tries to find uses for that biomass. For example, in the chemical industry, in buses, in trucks, even kerosene for aviation, I'm going to show you, is going to be 100% renewable in Brazil, not because we want to have planes flying on, let's say, on biomass, but because we need negative emissions. And in order to that, the cheapest solution the model finds is to have bio-CCS, and you have to find a use for that biofuel that's going to be produced. Okay, I'm not going to go into details. In terms of electricity, what's interesting here now is to begin to confront. Let's look at 2050. Let's say these three three stacks here: the current policies, the 2-degree scenario, and the 1.5. What calls the attention here is, for example, in a 2-degree scenario for the power sector, my model sees a lot of opportunity for natural gas power plants with CCS, because CCS for natural gas power plants is enough to keep Brazil inside that budget. But if I move into a 1.5-degree scenario, it's not more natural gas power plants. It's almost no natural gas power plant with or without CCS. But basically, I need to have a lot of sugarcane bagasse for power generation. Again, not because I need electricity from bagasse, but because I need negative emissions from biofuels, and then I have biomass. So why not burn biomass for power generation? So this is an interesting thing. Let's say if Brazil wants to go to a 1.5 degree, it's not something that in the middle of the road, say, no, I'm going to go to a 2-degree world, and then in the middle of the road, I'm going to go to a 1.5. You have to know in advance that a 1.5 world, in the case of Brazil, is substantially different than a 2C world. So you cannot adjust in the middle of the road your way. You have to decide upfront where you want to go to choose the right technologies to do that. Okay, let me run here. So in that case, these are the different emissions from the power sector in a current policy scenarios, the black line, in a 2C world, in a 1.5. So you see that the power sector has substantially different emissions in a 2-degree world than in a 1.5. I think this is one of the most interesting slides I have in here. Is exactly what I mentioned before. Let's say, in the case of the liquid biofuels production in Brazil, we see, let's say, a 2C world in 2050, we're going to have lots of first generation ethanol, or not so much, let's say, lots of, let's say, second generation ethanol. We're going to have some second generation ethanol with CCS, which is bio-CCS. We're going to have biodiesel, and also we're going to have some biodiesel with CCS. If we move into a 1.5C world, or in this case Brazil, we see a huge amount of biofuels being generated. Again, not because we need biofuels, but because we need negative emissions. And since I need a lot of negative emissions, as a result of that, I have a lot of biofuels available. So my model begins to put, for example, you see here that on the top, all kerosene produced in Brazil for aviation will be biomass based, because my model is going to use kerosene for Brazil, and also because of my global model, we see opportunity to export biokerosene to other countries. In that case, we have negative emissions in Brazil, but we export biokerosene to third parties. The same, all diesel produced in Brazil will be biomass to liquids with CCS diesel. So it's a 100% renewable biodiesel. Why? Because we're still going to have trucks, we're still going to need bunker fuel for ships, etc. So my model sees where it can put, let's say, biofuels, again, not because we need biofuels, but we need to have negative emissions. Okay, I'm not going to go into details here. So based on what we see here, for example, giving a zoom into the transport sector, what I see here is that a 2C world, in the case of Brazil, we're going to have some electric vehicles running in Brazil, but in a 1.5, all cars will need to be electric, and then we're going to have, let's say, electricity. We are not going to use ethanol for cars anymore, because since the entire fleet of cars will be electrified, we don't need ethanol for cars anymore. We don't need gasoline anymore. But then we are going to have, as I said, all kerosene produced in Brazil for aviation is going to be green. All diesel produced in Brazil is going to be green, again, because of the need of CCS. And then, okay, you see here, the different emissions in the transport sector of Brazil, in a current policy scenario, in a 2C scenario, in a 1.5, again, just showing that the current policies in Brazil is not that different of what would be the role of Brazil in a 2C scenario. So basically, if the world decides to go 2C only, it seems that Brazil does not need to change much. But if the world decides to go to 1.5, it's a completely different Brazil. And I guess we're going to do this work in the future. For most countries, this is going to be completely different if you do that. Okay, so it's my short presentation. This is where I come from. This is where I'm heading to. Thank you very much for for being here. So I'm open to some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very nice and clear presentation. We already have some questions actually from people connected through GoToMeeting. We have 72 people following the webinar. The first question is from Breno Pietracci, who's actually a former student, a former PhD student from Ca' Foscari University. He's asking the question from Brazil, USD EDF. So the first question he has is, how do you set the carbon budget for Brazil? And how does the budget link to the NDC of Brazil?
Okay, very briefly, let's say that the carbon budget that I have in here for Brazil comes from a run of our global model that saw the world inside this carbon budget for the world, and then the model, which is a least cost optimization model, decided how to allocate as a least cost the different carbon budgets to the different regions of a model. And since my model is one region, then this global model gave that budget to Brazil. So I use that carbon budget for Brazil as a constraint to run my model. I have not presented this here, but basically, in fact, let's say, the numbers of the Brazilian NDC for 2025 and 2030 are compatible with a 2C world, according to my model. But only the total numbers, not the details of the NDC of Brazil, because the NDC of Brazil provides, let's say, a total number of emissions, like 1.3 gigatons of CO2 equivalent by 2025, 1.2 gigatons of CO2 equivalent by 2030. So these numbers are compatible with a 2C world, but the details of the NDC in terms of the share of different sectors of the economy is completely different to what our model sees as the least cost optimum solution for Brazil.
So yeah, it's a cost-effective implementation.
Yes, and the NDC had nothing to do with cost-effective implementation. It's just a number, which is not bad in total, but the discrimination of the number is not that great.
Okay, are there questions from the people following the seminar here? Any curiosity? Lorenza? Lorenza Campagnolo from CMCC.
Hi, thank you for this seminar. I was wondering, I saw in a graph that both energy and emission were, primary energy and emissions were dropping in 2025. What was the reason behind that, given that probably the constraint is 2030?
There are different reasons for that. Not only, unfortunately, the bad shape of the Brazilian economy. So emissions today are below what they were 5 years ago. So there are some macroeconomic reasons for that. This is one thing. Then, let's say, our model begins to see by 2025, 2030, for example, electric vehicles begin to penetrate, some more public transportation, more efficient technologies, wind is becoming more popular in Brazil, solar. So, let's say, we see a natural trend in Brazil, but also with some economic reason behind that, why these emissions are going down up to 2025, 2030, and then again, if you do not do anything, then they're going to go up. That's why somehow the Brazilian NDC is a kind of business as usual scenario. There's nothing that has to be done in order for Brazil to meet its targets of the NDC. Again, let's say, in terms of absolute numbers, you have to do a lot of things if you want to have this reduction to be sustainable over time. But if you just look at the global numbers, Brazil will meet its NDC without any problem. And then the problem is going to come later, because we're going to have a kind of lock-in effect that's going to make things much more difficult for you to do later on.
Gabriele Standardi, also from CMCC here in Venice.
Thank you for the nice presentation. I'm just a curiosity. How do you, if you model the land competition in Brazil between, I don't know, agriculture and energy, because this can be important for food security and so on?
Oh yeah, exactly. This is the very reason why we decided to develop this BLUES model, which is a land use and energy model. So basically, we have all this information, and then the model may decide to have more biofuels. In that case, you're going to compete with food production, or less biofuels and import food. So this is, everything is being taken into account, the productivity of the different crops, the availability of water, distance from the market. So this is exactly the purpose of having this integrated model. So, because what we saw in the past, and this is also a criticism to the NDC of Brazil, for example, because before there was no integrated model in Brazil, so we saw a lot of contradictions, more biofuels, more food production, more as if these things were not competing with each other. And that's why also a integrated model for Brazil is not good enough. You have to have a global model, because otherwise we also saw some crazy situations, like our model choosing a lot of, for example, biofuels to Brazil to reduce emissions from the transport sector, and then the model may decide to export gasoline. But if I don't know if there's someone else in the world interested, why only Brazil will electrify its transport sector or use biofuels and export gas, and other countries are not interested in doing the same? So who's going to buy that gasoline? That's why we need to have a global model to make sure that international trade is well represented in the models as well.
We actually have several questions from people following the webinar on GoToMeeting. Laurent Drouet from CMCC Italy is asking about mitigation of non-CO2 emissions in the land use sector. It seems there is not much of that, and he's asking whether you plan to do that in the future.
Yeah, in fact, let's say, I did not have time to go into details. In fact, there are a lot of mitigation going on in the land use sector in Brazil. For example, I did not explore that, but there's a lot of cattle intensification in the land use sector. Just to give an example, Brazil has the largest livestock population in the world. We're talking about roughly 200 million cows in Brazil. And we're talking about roughly 200,000 hectares of land just for cattle in Brazil, meaning 1 head per hectare. You can very easily raise 2 or 3 heads per hectare. So our model sees that. So basically the model is looking for, okay, what's best, let's say, to have this 1 head per hectare or to confine cattle. In that case, the model sees the possibility of collecting, let's say, the dung from the cattle in order to avoid methane emissions. So everything's being considered. So the amount of fertilizers the model may choose to use in order to produce more of this crop or this other one. And depending upon the fertilizer amount you use, you have more N2O emissions or less. So all these non-CO2 emissions are being considered as technological options inside the model, and the model decides what to do.
I think related to this point, there is another question from Miana Lazen, Wageningen University in the Netherlands, asking about the conflict with food security given the high emphasis on biofuels. She's also kind of surprised to see so little room for solar energy.
Okay, let's respond backwards. We do not see small room for solar in Brazil. What happens is that the model sees that solar in Brazil is too expensive yet. And why is that? I was talking with Henrique before, 80% of the population in Brazil lives in big cities. So you do not have enough roofs in Brazil for solar. It's different if you live in houses where, okay, anyone can have your own solar panel. It's not the reality in Brazil. So what the model sees, and not only that, let's say, what do you do with solar power during the night? So you have to have some kind of storage, which we used to have in the past using hydro reservoir, but now the hydro reservoirs are much smaller. So the model sees the potential for solar based on the cost effectiveness of solar as compared to energy efficiency, wind, etc., etc. So there are some potential for solar, but again, let's say the model sees other cheapest options to do that. Regarding the second question, in fact, the model is taking this into account. Let's say if you take the case of Brazil today, Brazil has the largest agricultural sector in the world, about the same size of the US. And even in that case, and also the biofuels program in Brazil is the second largest in the US, and even in that case, less than 10% of the agricultural area in Brazil is used for biofuels production. And the total agricultural area in Brazil today is roughly 70 million hectares of land. Cattle alone in Brazil uses 200 million hectares of land. So you can more than triple agriculture in Brazil simply by, let's say, better confining cattle, or if Brazil decides not to be anymore a big exporter of meat to the world. So, but again, once you have integrated the model, all these things are being taken into account. So my model is choosing more biofuels, but it's taking care to avoid competition with food production. So this is being taken into account.
We have many questions from the web, but I just wanted to check whether there are questions also from Venice. Otherwise, we keep going with the questions from, now we have JC Hyde from University of Florida. And she's asking whether you could discuss a bit the role of hydropower. Whether do you see a need for an expansion in hydropower in the future?
Yeah, let's say, how do we do this? Let's say our model has to be very clear about the availability of the different resources, and this means resources for hydroelectric production, oil production, gas production, solar irradiation, wind availability, land for biofuels, etc., etc. And based on what happened in Brazil, let's say, although Brazil today, some 60% of all electricity produced in Brazil comes from hydro, and even being a large amount, we only use 1/3 of our hydro potential. But the problem is that of the remaining potential of hydro potential, more than half of that is in the Amazon region, which is a very flat region, meaning that new hydros in the Amazon would mean big floodings in there. And not only that, we need to have 3, 4, 5,000 kilometers of transmission lines to bring that electricity from the Amazon to Rio or to São Paulo. So all these, let's say, limitations are available to the model. How much that would cost, what would the implication of that flooding, the cost of transmission lines. So basically, by providing this information to the model does not see a bright future for hydro in Brazil anymore, because it seems that hydro is too expensive because of these environmental constraints. So we still see some increase in new hydros for the next 5 or 10 years at most, but nothing significant. What we really see that's going to be significant is wind, is going to be very important, energy efficiency, and also biomass-based power generation because of the need of bio-CCS for a 2C or 1.5 degree world. And
this is not considering the vulnerability of hydro, the impact.
This is another issue, very important, that Henrique is calling attention. This is something, a work that we did in the past, which we're going to continue to do in the future, which is not only that, which is to superimpose also another constraint, which is the vulnerability of hydroelectricity in Brazil to climate change. And some studies that we did in the past showed that the Amazon region is extremely vulnerable to climate change. Let's say chances are that precipitation is going to be much lower in the north of Brazil, in the Amazon. Precipitation is going to be much lower in the northeast of Brazil, and precipitation is going to be much higher in the south. But since we do not have, let's say, big reservoirs in the south anymore, even if it rains more in the south, basically you have to throw away that water because you cannot store that extra water that you may get. And most of the new developments of hydro in Brazil would be in the north of Brazil, which are going to become dry. So that's why also there is this limitation. But in this study, we're not taking into account this extra constraint.
We have 2 more questions on the implementation of the global stabilization policy. Breno Pietracci is asking again whether the model uses a carbon tax to achieve the goals, or whether carbon offsets are taken into account.
Yeah, in fact, let's say, there are 2 ways to do this. Let's say, one way, we used to do that as well, is to, let's say, impose an implicit carbon price, which doesn't mean that it's a carbon tax. There are different economic mechanisms to translate a implicit price in a tax. So one way is to say, okay, let's put a carbon price of $5, 10, 11, C, 20, 100, 300, and see what would be the carbon budget that would result from that, and then say, okay, a world compatible with a 2-degree world, 2C world is a world with carbon prices of $100 per ton of CO2. The other way, which we did this time, is to do the other way around, is to impose a carbon budget and see what will be the implicit carbon price behind that. And this is exactly what we did, let's say. A 1.5-degree world is more expensive than a 2C world, and it's more expensive than a business usual world. And then we can take from our model what's the implicit carbon price to allow for this carbon budget. So this is exactly that. So when my model chooses a lot of bio-CCS in Brazil, bio-CCS or electric vehicles are more expensive than what we have today. In order to do that, there's an implicit carbon price that I can say, okay, it's $50, $70. So the carbon price in this case, I take out of the model, and it's not something that I assume a priori.
Okay. I'm reading all these questions coming from GoToMeeting. We have Fee Steele from University of Potsdam in Germany. She's asking about urban emissions, whether you pay particular attention also to the emissions at the urban level. And she's also asking whether those are included in the national NDC.
Let's say our model is very detailed, but it is detailed at a sectorial level. So we have, let's say, details for industry, for transportation, residential sector, etc. But we're not discriminating this by urban regions. So for example, emissions from cities, part of those emissions are being accounted for in the transport sector. Part of those emissions are being accounted for in the household sector, but we do not have a specific focus on the rural versus urban emissions. Could be done, but it's not our focus. In the case of the NDC Brazil, no. Let's say the NDC Brazil is extremely general. Let's say it's just a big numbers and some qualitative discussions of how much of those numbers, of those emission reductions, will come from the energy sector, from deforestation, from agriculture, but not specific enough to go in more details than that to see how much going to come from urban centers. No, it's not that detailed. But again, we have done this in the past, is to run our models, imposing as a restriction the compliance with the absolute number of the Brazilian NDC. And by doing that, somehow we built an NDC backwards to say, okay, what would be the least cost solution for Brazil to comply to the NDC? And then we could see what would be the role of each sector of the economy in that total number of the Brazilian NDC.
I also wanted to ask a question. Okay. So you mentioned that the big difference between the 1.5 and 2 degree world, which means that you have to start planning well in advance. And I was just wondering whether you consider studying delayed scenarios. I mean, is there an option to go to the 1.5 degree?
Yeah, let's say we have not done that, but we could do that, and also in the seedlings project this is being considered. But I can anticipate that the implication for that would need to be much more negative emissions right after what we saw in here. So basically, if you have a delay scenario, you're going to use more of your carbon budget in the short term that you can, and then you have to compensate later on. How you're going to compensate? The only way to compensate is if more negative emission, meaning more reforestation, more negative emission from the energy sector, and we are playing that. What we intend to do now, and there was a reason why I only run my model up to 2050, because this was the protocol we use for the national models in the seedlings project. So we are considering now running our national model up to 2100. And if you do that, I can expect a different solution, because in that case, I have more room for delay actions now, and I have more time later on, either for new technologies, either for more negative emissions or more reforestation later on. In the case of reforestation, I did not enter into this detail, but the model is smart enough to know that in order to plant a tree and to have an adult tree, you need at least 7 to 10 years. So the model sees that. So if I need to have a certain amount of negative emission by 2050, I have to plant my tree at most by 2040. So the model sees that. But if I allow my model to run up to 2060, 2070, 2080, then eventually I can plant more trees later on, because I have more time to have negative emissions. And these are all issues that we are working on now.
I think we can conclude with this final question from Marta Teixeira, asking whether the goal of 2 degrees, in your opinion, is it still possible?
Well, I'm also part of this ongoing, almost done, IPCC special report on 1.5. And let's say, I don't want to anticipate result, but we're going to see that the 1.5 world is extremely difficult. It's still possible, but extremely difficult, and very much relying on negative emissions, bio-CCS, etc. The 2C world is not that complicated yet. So let's say, I'm not that pessimistic about the 2C world. The 1.5 I am, because I think it's going to be really difficult, but the 2C is still okay. But provided that we do not take much longer to take action. So just to respond to the question, I think the 2C world is possible, but we don't have much more than, I don't know, 5 years, 3 years, 10 years at most to really be, let's say, effective on our policies. Otherwise, even the 2C world is not going to be, unless this is a discussion we have in the 1.5 degree special report IPCC, the issue of overshooting. One thing is to see, okay, I want to have a 2C world by 2100 without overshooting, or to allow the overshooting to 2.3 degrees by 2080 and then come down again. So also we have to define what we understand by the 2C world and a 1.5, with overshooting or without overshooting.
And when will the IPCC report be published?
It's going to be published in October.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I would like to thank you all for being with us for this webinar, also the people from home asking these very interesting questions. I just wanted to remind you that the webinar has been recorded and will be uploaded on CMCC website, and the people attending the seminar will receive a link. Just to remind you, the next webinar will be on June 26th, and it will be about Antarctic climate variability over the last 2,000 years. So we go back in history, different perspective, from Barbara Stenni, and Carlo Barbante will be moderating the seminar. Thank you again, and have a good day.
Thank you very much.